Some frequently asked questions about California suspense files. Which committees use a suspense file? The two appropriations committees in the California Legislature have a process they call the suspense file. Now, under the Assembly rules, the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee also has a suspense file, but this FAQ is focused on the two fiscal committees. How does a bill get referred to the Appropriations Committee? First, any bill which has been keyed fiscal by the Office of Legislative Counsel is re-referred to the Fiscal Committee in each House, which we call the Appropriations Committee, unless that measure is placed on consent or the amount of the bill's fiscal impact is determined to be below a certain threshold established by the respective fiscal committees. What's the purpose of the suspense file? It's generally used by the two appropriations committees in the Senate and Assembly as a means of managing their bills. The intent behind the suspense file is to consider and vote upon all the fiscal related bills at one single time, followed by a determination of whether those bills stay or leave the suspense file. How is a bill placed on the suspense file? The bills may be referred to suspense by a vote of a majority of the members of the committee that are present and voting, pending further considerations by the committee. How is a bill removed from the suspense file? A bill may be taken off the suspense file and heard upon 2 days' notice, published in the daily file by a vote of a majority of the members of the committee present and voting. How many of the introduced bills have a fiscal impact? The vast majority of these bills, on average about 80% of them, go before the Appropriations Committee of each House for consideration after the Policy Committee has passed the bill, but before the bill reaches the floor of the respective House. What is the suspense file threshold in the Assembly? In the Assembly Appropriations Committee, bills referred to the suspense file are those with a fiscal impact of $150,000 or more from any fund source in any fiscal year, as well as any bill in which the primary purpose is to create a task force, a commission, a work group, a report, or a study. And all of these categories meet the criteria for referral to the committee suspense file. What's the suspense file threshold in the Senate? In the Senate Appropriations Committee, the bills referred to the suspense file are those bills that would have a fiscal impact in any single fiscal year from the general fund, including GO bond funds, or from private funds of $50,000 or more. Also referred to the suspense file are pilot project bills if the statewide implementation of the project or program would result in a fiscal impact of $50,000 or more in any single fiscal year. Is there any exception to the suspense file rules? An exception to this rule applies if the bill is a deficiency bill or a supplemental appropriations bill that's authored by the chair of the Senate or the Assembly Budget Committee, or a claims bill or a judgment and settlement bill authored by the chair of the Senate or Assembly Appropriations Committee. So what is a fiscal impact? It's generally defined to include cost increases, cost pressures, revenue decreases, increases in appropriations subject to limitation that are restricted in their use, and reductions in the state appropriations limit, or the SAL. Are bills usually presented if they're being referred to the suspense file? In both the Assembly and Senate Appropriations Committees, the bill authors usually do not testify at the suspense file hearing. In fact, in most instances, bills that have been placed on the suspense file do not have any testimony presented on the bill, either for or against the measure. How does the Assembly handle bills on the suspense file? The Assembly Appropriations Committee dispenses with all bills at the suspense file hearing, and the bills are either passed, passed as amended, or held on suspense. How does the Senate handle bills on the suspense file? The Senate Appropriations Committee only announces bills for which there will be a vote, so no action is actually taken on bills that are held on the suspense file. What are the possible actions that can be taken on suspense file bills? Historically, there were three actions that the Assembly and Senate Appropriations Committees took on measures pending on their respective suspense files: do pass as amended, or hold in committee. More recently, a fourth action has been used during the first year, or the odd-numbered year of session, to distinguish between two types of holding measures on suspense: a 2-year bill. When does a bill not go to the suspense file? If a bill does not reach the fiscal threshold for the suspense file, 50,000 in the Senate and 150,000 in the Assembly, then a measure can be acted upon at that hearing and will be passed to the floor by a majority vote of the committee members. What happens to a bill that does not go to the suspense file? For bills that are not placed on the suspense file in either House's fiscal committee, there can be one of the following actions: do pass as amended, consent, or 28.8 to the floor, which is only in the Senate. What is Senate Rule 28.8? Basically, it allows the Senate Fiscal Committee Chair to send measures directly to the Senate floor if there are no significant costs or revenue loss attributable to that measure. And finally, what are the two types of amendments that are generally used by the respective appropriations committees? They're either author's amendments or they're deemed to be committee amendments.